life. George says the virtues are going to look into the noble ends in certain situations, whereas prudence will deliberate about the means of achieving those ends just to get that cleared up. Yeah, I mean, that's traditionally the way that we present it. The virtues orient us towards, and they orient us not just cognitively, but affectively towards the right outcomes, the right intentions. And then prudence is like, think about it like each of the virtues is being sort of like a boss who knows where things ought to go. And then prudence comes along and is the team of employees that are like, okay, great, we got a mandate. How are we going to make this happen in the most efficient way possible? That's part of what prudence is doing. So it's looking at means, right? Means to ends. But like I said, it's also looking more broadly at like the situation that you're in and looking at what's most important about the situation, what factors you could ignore or downplay. Prudence could also be helpful for maybe bringing up things um, that you've got sort of in the back of your mind. And you're like, we need to highlight this, right? Maybe that's part of what it does. Again, we're going beyond Aristotle's own discussion here in saying these things. Well, so George says, I wanted to ask, how does Aristotle view the virtues in terms of the rational versus the non-rational parts of the soul? I'm a little confused about Aristotle's notion of corrective justice from last class. So two different questions really there. And so let's talk about the first one, the rational versus the non-rational parts of the soul. So earlier on in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle talks about us as having you can call it desirous or emotional. The Greek word for it is orektike, and orexis, the word that we get erektike from, means something like affectivity or desire or feeling in general. And for Aristotle, desires for bodily pleasures, epithumia, they're one kind of orexis. The desirous modality that leads to anger and other things connected to that, thumos, that's also a form of orexis. Likewise, what we often translate as wish or will, boulesis, that's a form of orexis. The emotions in general are types of orexis, and so is choice, deliberative choice, or proeresis. All of these bear on that part of the soul that we actually have in common with animals, because animals are driven by these, although not by boulesis as such. And so that's let's call it the lower part of the soul. It's not the vegetative part that handles like respiration and digestion, all these things that we're not really aware of. It's an animal part of the soul. And then on top of that, we have the rational part of the soul, right? And as we're going to see in just a couple of minutes, the rational part of the soul is actually, for Aristotle, divided into two parts. But what matters as far as the moral virtues go is they shape and bear upon the orektike part of the soul, and they make it amenable to listening to the rational part of the soul. As he says, like a son can obey or listen to his father, and then take advice or orders from him. So the moral virtues, they're informed by the higher part of the soul, right? But they exist within this desirous, affective part of the soul, that is below that in Aristotle's ordering. And the goal is to sort of integrate these together. Now, about the corrective justice, right? We could think, for example, that maybe you would need to use the higher part of the soul, and I think that would be quite right, um, in order to figure out how to rectify things, and that would make perfect sense. But the disposition, the hexis, the habit, would exist in the lower part of the soul, this tendency towards doing justice, this willingness to be just with other people, desiring it, taking pleasure in justice, pain in injustice. And corrective justice is, you could say that corrective justice exists because other forms of justice sometimes miss the mark, and we need to, like, if we've got a distribution that was unfair, we need to fix it somehow. And it's also a way of dealing, as we saw before, with criminality, where criminals are getting over on other people and taking more than their fair share. So we're going to talk about what deliberation means, but that tells you what kind of affectivity. Later on, he's also going to tell us in this very famous passage that it's kind of a bridge, proeresis, between, to go to George's question, the higher and lower parts of the soul. Proeresis, choice, deliberative choice, is, there's two Greek terms here. It's nous orectike, which can be translated as mind informed by desire, but it's also orexis dianoetike, desire informed by intellect or mind, right? And so it's kind of this bridge place within us. He'll also tell us that proeresis is that the guiding, you could call it, purpose, the henekatinos of proeresis, is orexis, desire, kai logos, principle or rationality. So this is a really important point, not so much about prudence, but about proeresis or choice, but it's going to come back to prudence. But let me take Allison's question right away and then maybe open it up to some other ones. Is it acceptable to map Aristotle's soul onto what the cognitive neuroscientist psychologists may term consciousness today, or is his concept of soul the same as psyche, like Plato? So neither. And I would say this is kind of a big question. You can't effectively take Aristotle's concept of soul and even map it onto Plato. They're not the same. For example, Plato has these three parts of the soul. The rational part, the middle thumotic part, and then the other part, the desires, which are multiple and stuff like that. Aristotle says those are all orexis. So there isn't like a rational desire in the rational part of the soul. It's existing in the erectike part. So there's some important differences. Similarly, Aristotle and Plato don't map neatly onto the Stoics. And, consciousness is not the same thing as what you could call the soul in ancient times. Consciousness would be a part of it. And I think that the contemporary neuroscientists and psychologists are all over the map. I mean, if we just stick with neuroscience, there's not complete consensus in that field about what consciousness is, period. If we extend it further to psychology, then we've got an even bigger problem, you could say, because there are so many schools of psychology and they don't all have the same ideas about things. So I think that what you can do is you can try to find sometimes parallels, but you're not going to find mappings. You're not going to find complete coincidences. By the way, I mentioned too that this comes up all the time whenever I teach Freud, because Freud has a tripartite understanding of the soul, and there's something that kind of seems like Freud's id in the appetites, and Freud actually says so, but the other two parts of the soul don't map neatly onto what Plato has going on either. And to go back to Allison's question about mapping Aristotle's, let's call it his model, onto others, I think that this is, in some respects, a more robust model than what a lot of contemporary psychologists or neuroscientists are working with. And that's part of what I find very attractive about Aristotle and his moral psychology myself. I think that's part of what attracts a lot of neo-Aristotelians, as they get called, to this sort of account. And let's take the question that George had. So, does phronesis give moral commands such as whatever is just is good? So, whatever is just is good would not be a command as such. That would be something more like a general principle. And that's a great question. Um, does phronesis give sort of general principles? Yes and no. Um, it makes use of them. And you can say, well, where does it get those from? And maybe the question um, could be answered by saying other people's phronesis, but Aristotle doesn't himself say that, right? And so, actually, to go to George's question, one of the things that Aristotle says is that prudence is not just a matter of the general, right? The katholu, the universal, but also takes account of particular matters because action deals with the particulars. So you could have something. I mean, I don't know that prudence would operate with something at the level of generality of whatever is just as good, but it could be a little bit further down if we want to get to the door opening thing. Why do we open doors for people? Well, because we want to preserve a certain kind of etiquette, or we see that they're struggling with things and we need to get the door open for them so they can bring in all the packages. And we might go through some, like, there's some general ideas and then there's the specific case, because we could also have like somebody come to the door and we're like, I'm not opening the door for that jerk. He never opens the door for me. I'm going to send him a message, right? That could also be a matter of prudence as well. And Aristotle says that prudence is concerned with integrating both the general and the particular things, doing that well. Now, does he give us advice about exactly how we do that? No, and that is one of the issues with his discussions of prudence. It's kind of underdetermined, you could say. Right? He tells us that sunesis, or understanding, is concerned with things that we can doubt about and deliberate about. And it's concerned with the same things as prudence, but it's not quite the same thing as prudence. Why? Well, prudence's point or end, the goal of having prudence, is to provide statements. And this kind of goes to George's question about giving moral commands. Prudence's end is a statement about what we ought to do or ought not to do, either generally or in this particular situation. And so it does give orders. The Greek term for that is epitaktike, like lays down things that we should do. It arranges things, you could say. But understanding just makes judgments. He says kritike monon. So a judgment is not quite the same thing yet as an order. You could say that an order, the process of creating an order, uses judgment, but it's not exactly the same thing as a judgment. So understanding doesn't actually mean having or getting prudence, as he says, but it's connected with it. So he says, we're wrapping this up. Let me take Allison's question about the natural virtues. So, are they genetic or inherited things? I mean, Aristotle doesn't have a conception of genetics. He does have a conception of temperament in a very broad sense, right? Which can be determined to some degree by the bodily humors within us. Obviously, he has a whole different conception of medicine and physics than we do. But if he were around in the present, I think he probably would view these as like genetic, or having their origins in our nature. For example, things often do run in families, and the causality gets very complicated, right? If you grow up with somebody, so I'll just give you an example from my family, right? And I'll give you two examples. So I'm adopted in both my biological families of origin and in my adopted family on my mother's side. There is a lot of bipolar disorder. My birth mother suffers from that and a number of other things. Um, my adopted mother's family, my uncle Aim was severely bipolar. Many of my cousins are bipolar. My mom was manic. My adopted mom, she only got the one side of it, and so you could say, well, I'm not bipolar, but I suffer from depression. Is that in part caused by my genetics or the family that you're involved in or by other factors? It's complex, right? Similarly, I kind of got the double whammy when it came to anger and irascibility, right? I mean, I've got a biological dad who wound up becoming a police chief after doing a whole bunch of other policing things and being in the army and stuff like that. And he was a pretty aggressive guy back in the day, right? And that made him good at some of the things that he did, but it also, showed a tendency towards aggression and stuff like that. Some of that might be genetic. That might be why I was attracted, as were also my half brother and sister, to going into the army. All of us went in the army. Um, and you could also get some stuff from your family that you're growing up with. So I think maybe temperament is a complicated thing that could involve genetics, but also could involve mimesis, patterning after people. And there may be other factors involved as well. Now, those would give us these natural virtues or perhaps natural vices, right? Somebody could be badly off with respect to anger because of their genetics, because of the family that they grow up in, where everybody yells at each other at the drop of a hat. And then, so following up with the second part, then we grow them or diminish them intellectually or morally through learning prudently. That's exactly it, I think, as far as Aristotle is concerned. Prudence by itself won't pull that off, but with other things like, role models, some degree of education, whatever else, practicing, whatever else we want to throw in there. And we're probably, when it comes to these matters, kind of badly off in our society, in part because we often do treat virtues as if they're something just natural, like you just have them or you don't have them, right? Whereas Aristotle thinks that they require a lot of work and cultivation. So that's a really important thing to ask about, you know. Get those done. Okay, so George has a good question. Can the environment shape our prudence in right or wrong ways, such as rewarding certain vices too much, contrary to ignoring certain virtues in our society? So I don't think that would be shaping prudence. It would be instead like fostering certain vices, right? Or making it difficult to not just practice certain virtues, but maybe even know what they are, right? So if you grew up in, let's just take one example, you grew up in a super macho society as a man, right? You're probably going to have a screwed up set of dispositions with respect to anger, with respect to courage. You're probably going to be more rash than courageous, and maybe some other things as well. Maybe conspicuous consumption leads to intemperance, maybe a lack of generosity or being spendthrift or things like that, right? So the society could be getting in the way not only of developing the virtues, but even understanding what a virtuous disposition as opposed to a vicious disposition would look like. Because remember, people who are vicious often think that they're the virtuous ones, right? So if your whole society is like, somebody got in your face, kick their ass, and you get that message over and over and over again, which I got as a kid, you're probably going to um, be badly off and vicious. Now, Does that get in the way of prudence? Yes, but not in quite a direct way. So remember that prudence has to do with the particulars and also with the generalities and also with the last or ultimate things, right? So prudence requires some development. If you have a bad society, you might not have any models of people who are actually prudent. Although that's probably not the case, because even bad societies have some people who hold things together. So there's probably some, but it probably takes you a lot more work to get at them. So, if you have kind of, jackasses as your mom and dad and family, you're going to be worse off most likely. But then again, as adolescents, you could have somebody who's quite prudent. Actually, even I'll not just as adolescents, for people like me, well into your 20s, you could have people who are very prudent, and you should have been smart enough to recognize them as prudent, and you wrote them off. I think about some of my professors. One of the guys who gave me the best advice is somebody who I only took one class with, and didn't spend an awful lot of time with, Tom Alexander. But looking back on it, he was the most phronimos, the most practically wise person that I knew in the department. And he did give me helpful advice at one time. I'm there. Nicole says, how do you deal with people who are misguided at work? They slack off and don't produce good quality work. Well, it depends on what your situation is in relation to them. So if those people are reporting to you, there you've got a little bit of power that you could exercise, right? You could say, listen, your performance is not up to the standards that we expect. I'm going to coach you, and we're going to write this down, as documentation, and you better start performing a little bit better, right? And maybe that'll work, and maybe it won't, right? Sometimes you have to fire people after you do that. If it's a coworker, it's a bit tougher, right? It's not like you have any power over them. You can say things like, I don't appreciate when you don't do your work because you're making more work for me. But I mean, this is where the Stoics have things right. You don't control what the other person does as a response. So dealing with is in part what you can do on your part. And you could also look at your own responses to them. Are you getting like really pissed off with them or envious about the fact that they're getting away with things? You can say, well, I don't want to be constantly feeling these negative emotions. How can I look at this situation in ways that protect me and allow me to function within the workplace, even though everybody else isn't doing everything that they're supposed to be doing? That would be my general suggestions. But this is where we get into the particulars, right? Are they slacking off because they're the boss's nephew and they got put in there? Are they slacking off because they're kind of a lazy person who's never done good work wherever they are? Are they slacking off because the workplace is screwed up and they were a good employee once, but now they're kind of burnt out or disengaged, which some people estimate is about 40% of the current American workplace. That was pre-COVID too, by the way. These are all different kinds of situations, right? There's probably not much you can do about the boss's nephew, but somebody who's burnt out, maybe you can find ways to get their as we say, their head back in the game, right? So it's gonna the tahikasta, the particulars, are going to be very important in situations like that. Allison says, may it be fair to suggest the rational part of our soul may not develop till at least our late 20s? Maybe there's a correlation with brain development. Yeah, I think for Aristotle, there definitely is. He didn't know that the brain was doing the thinking. He thought the heart does it. He thought the brain was something like a radiator, helping to cool the blood, and but he does have kind of a bodily or somatic understanding of how things work. So like anger, for example, he says this in the on the soul, can be understood physically as a boiling of blood around the heart. It can be understood psychologically as a desire to impose suffering in a return, retaliation, and these all kind of come together, right? So yeah, the capacity to actually fully, because it's not as if teenagers can't reason at all, right? But to fully practically reason, maybe it is dependent to some degree on brain development. We do know that like the decision making centers of the brain are not fully developed until like the mid 20s. Doesn't mean that they don't exist, of course, right? Because kids make decisions and carry out prioritizations, but they're not as fully developed as somebody in their late 20s. I think there's clearly something there. Aristotle does point out, this is in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, that aging by itself does not automatically provide maturity. There's a lot of immature older people, right? But there is something to this bodily development going on, and a lot of the factors that all of you have been bringing up, environment, what our homes look like, the kind of workplaces we have, our education in public education or private education, whatever you have going on, all of these, well, in our general culture, what it is that we're getting to see on TV, on our phones, all of those play important roles in shaping us to some degree. So I think these are some very important factors. And we could say that part of being prudent would be realizing how these factors work on us and deciding, what we're going to allow and what we're not, right? Maybe there's some things that it would be prudent not to watch all that much, right? Maybe it would be prudent to say, I want to listen to these people, but I'm not going to pay attention to what these people have to say. But I kind of think a lot of these, I don't think prudence is like an on-off switch. I think it's like the other moral virtues. It's something that you can have more or less of, and that we don't want to be perfectionists about this, because if we are, we're going to be dismaying because we don't have complete prudence. I mean, I'm not a completely prudent person myself. And I've been studying philosophy for, in academic ways for 32 years. But I'm better off than I certainly was when I first started. And I think probably most of you can say similar things about your own study of philosophy, or maybe all of you can. That'd be wonderful if you can. But we're not gods who get everything right all the time. Was helpful for you, George? You say you've got a light bulb moment. Yeah, I think it is a digression too. I think it's very important in general in philosophy, and I think this can extend to other things like psychology as well. Um, we want to consider examples. This is a very important way of making sense of things. We've got a general theory, and then we think about, well, what would that look like here? How would that play out in the workplace, in my relationship with my dad, in my relationship with this pet that I have, or things along those lines.